Good evening. First, I'd like to say that, Geraldine, I'm so happy you're late. I'll tell you, so Greek of yours. You know, they say that once in Thessaloniki, you always have a home place. And this is a very popular sentiment reflecting, the welcoming atmosphere of Thessaloniki. So I'd like to thank Father Herovim that brought Geraldine with us. So, So it's my honor to chair this plenary session entitled "The Wound of Christian Identity in Times of Division." Our theme invites us to reflect on how Christian identity, while a source of unity in Christ, has often been wounded and distorted when entangled with political, cultural, or national struggles. Our main speaker this evening is Professor Geraldine Smith, a Dominican sister, theologian, educator, and ecumenics. She has served in leadership within her Dominican order and twice as director of the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College in Dublin, where she is now adjunct associate professor. Her lifelong has been at the intersection of theology, dialogue, and peace building, most notably as coordinator of the OPSA Commission during the troubles in Northern Ireland, and through all collaborations with the World Council of Churches, the United Nations, and international initiative of post-conflict reconciliation. She continues to write and teach on ecumenical ecclesiology, memory, and the vocation of Christians to heal divisions. Responding will be Dr. Eleni Kasselouri Hadjivasiliadi, a friend, a research and studies officer at the Greek National Center for Public Administration, and visiting lecturer at the International Hellenic University. She has extensive experience in teaching, research, and international ecumenical work, particularly with the World Council of Churches on issues of gender, justice, and inclusion. She has served as vice president of the European Society of Women in theological research and as advisor to multiple WCC programs, and is widely published in Greek, in English, and in German. So together, their contributions will help us probe how Christian identity can become both a wound and a healing force in our times. Professor Smith, the floor is yours.
I cannot but begin with a profound apology. The last couple of days getting here has been a series of accidents and mishaps, but at the end of every one of them, there was an angel of mercy that brought it for me to a good end, but I'm sorry for keeping you in this hot weather delayed so long. Reflecting on the wounds of Christian identity in times of division on this 17th centenary year of the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, in approaching this paper, in which my given range of focus will be Christian identity and the dynamics of confessional identities and their oppositional politico-religious formulations in Northern Ireland, it may be impertinent to start with the play on Tertullian's question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And yet when asking you, what has Nicaea to do with Northern Ireland? The specific terms of my title, Christian, Times, Wounds, Identity, and Division, may strike a chord. To acknowledge the significance of the theme of identity at Nicaea, one can note Constantine's avowal of the pivotal role of the Church in establishing peace, his recognition of the need for unity amid the valued diversity and range of ecclesial representatives he called together in service of peace, his recognition of the need for unity, albeit an imperial peace. It's beyond my competence to test for some saving grace within that state of affairs. Yet it is noteworthy that interlinked with this telos of peace between church and empire and between the churches themselves, politically and ecclesiologically, the Council of Nicaea held a central focus on the very identity of God. The Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, with each one's uniquely relational nature. Mutually and in mutual equality in personhood, prosopon, and sharing one divine substance, homoousios. I'm aware I'm conflating Nicaea and Constantinople at this point in terms of the Cappadocian influence at the latter. Response to this question of the identity of the triune God carries implications as to the purpose of God's relationship to humanity and the human person's response in and through the Son of the Father, made incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ, who made the Father known, promising the Holy Spirit as abiding source of grace and truth, unity and peace. This opens into the reality of the human person's connaturality through grace, with God as embodied and reflected in the relationship with Christ, who taught his disciples to pray, "Our Father, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The theological diversity and at times doctrinal contexts reveal a complicated picture of political upheaval, shifting ecclesial tensions and alliances, rendered still more opaque by conflicts of interpretive perspectives from philosophy, history, and historiography. In recent decades, scholars revisiting Nicaea and its surrounding discourse demonstrate how this background actually sharpens the significance of the quest for peaceful coexistence and more, and of the wrestling to understand the purpose, constructs, and method of conciliarity, synodality, and dialogue as central to the quest for unity. And amid the reality of diverse ecclesial traditions and cultural practices. In context, method, therefore, this wellspring creedal situation still speaks to our condition in various direct and analogous ways. There is much that needs to be re-received by the Church in our contemporary intractable conflict and division in church and world, and between churches amid the interplay of secular and religious powers. Churches called out of themselves to seek and serve the common good of peace, witnessing by example through conciliar processes of dialogue, breaking down enmity and opening paths of hope, so that those of diverse cultural and religious identities can listen together, grow in harmony, and seek the peace of the city, challenging factional interests and walking the way together as ambassadors of reconciliation. So if I tell you that last year Ireland marked the silver jubilee of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, an agreement signed by the Prime Ministers of Britain and Ireland with the endorsement of a panel of opposed political parties and with the vocal support and prayer of religious leaders, endorsed by people's referenda in both parts of the island. And if I tell you that it benefited from global contributions from experts and peace builders from around the globe, maybe it won't seem so odd that I'm asking the question, and I hope you will not be left wondering any longer that at the question, what has the Council of Nicaea to do with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998? The Good Friday Agreement marked the beginning of the end of 3, 4, 5 centuries of cyclical conflict and a bloody history between Britain and Ireland, and 3 centuries of violent division within Ireland, in which Christianity and the churches contested relationship with the colonial double bind, in which conflicts of power, dissent, and Christian identity formed a recursive dynamic. James Joyce pointed a finger at this in a satirical poem in 1912, O Ireland, my first and only love, where Christ and Caesar are hand in glove. I played around with that and wondered now if I would turn it into something like, O Ireland, or O Christ, my shared and only, O Christ, my shared and only Lord. Sorry, I had a few attempts at this. O Ireland, my shared and open land, where Christ and Caesar can work hand in hand. In looking at the Ireland context as a kind of case study at the beginning of the end of centuries-old conflict, and before surveying a political history of its tensions and alliances, rendered still more... I'm sorry, I'm still not calmed down after the delay. In looking at the Ireland context as a kind of case study at the beginning of this centuries-old conflict, and before surveying a political religious overview in history terms, it's helpful to elucidate how the constitutive dimensions of Ireland's protracted conflict, and especially since the division of Ireland in 1921 between the governments in the two jurisdictions, North and South, and hostilities and resistance within Northern Ireland. Thus, the agreement legally constituted three constitutional axes governing the mode of British-Irish relations, providing bilateral interaction and specified power sharing between the South and North jurisdictions. And thirdly, a new system of consociational power sharing government within Northern Ireland. It's necessary to demonstrate how the determinative roles of colonialism, nationalism, and sectarianism, as understood in Ireland, with its sacralised politics and its politicised religion, had served to reinscribe systems of cyclical violence. This will be elucidated through a prism, first, that presents Ireland as what Frank Wright, a peace builder and political theorist, a member of the Corrymeela Community of Reconciliation, who died between the ceasefires of 1994 and the agreement in 1998, drawing on his theory of Ireland as an ethnic frontier, incorporating insights from politics, philosophy, cultural theories of mimetic violence, particularly that of René Girard, and from the peace-building action of Christian communities. Wright draws on all those. I'm not going to, but I hope that there will be something. Thank you. Wright highlights a complex, deep-dyed historical pattern of identities in opposition, contending that this pattern must be interrupted for the past to loosen its grip on the present. Identities in opposition had hardened and were essentialized by systems and centuries of separation, mutual exclusion, antagonistic acts of selective commemoration of past defeats or victories, religious and social segregation, tit-for-tat rivalry, and mimetic violence. Cicero claimed, apparently, that those who do not understand the past are condemned to repeat it. Rhetorically simplistic, probably, but throughout Ireland's protracted history of violence, the most salient feature is the repeated cyclical violence of two blocks, in the Gramsci sense of the term, who staged their opposing identity claims and truth claims and enactments of violence in repeating cycles of violence and retaliation. The British response of state containment of violence, and I use that word very broadly, typically showed reactions with swift force, followed by intervals of precarious truce, which Wright terms a false tranquility of mutual deterrence. Whereas sustained peace depends on the recurring cycle being interrupted for long enough for safe spaces to be formed, where mutually reinforcing fear and suspicion, blame and resentment can yield to growth in relationship. The key word in the preamble to the Belfast Agreement, apart from any of its contents, the key concept that holds everything together is relationship, appreciation of difference, and mutual recognition. The ethnic frontier, with its prevailing ideologies, bitter memories, and history of effects, ensured that the sectarian edifice was in a constant state of reconstruction and reinscription. Identities were honed against each other. Ethnic, religious, cultural, political, often in a violent nexus, as will be illustrated by examples. But it's important first to underline the principle that historically and in contemporary times, the peacemaking, and as in peace agreements, formal peacemaking, and peace-building process must confront and engage historical causes of violence and their history of effects. What at first sight appears to many onlookers as primordialist or imagined identity fixations often disclose the deeper force field of a colonially constructed paradigm, and Wright's insights were borne out in the years before the 1998 agreement on the need for a deep strategy of peacemaking embedded in peace-building initiatives that fostered new imagination. Peace required former enemies to meet in dialogue and encounter so that they might grow in relationship. That has always posed implications and hard questions for churches and Christians, as well as political and civic blocs, on whether they're prepared to reach across divides and renounce embattled identity stances as the cost of sustained and sustaining peace. Wright knew the invaluable role of such communities to be that kind of embodied presence, and as providing safe spaces for encounter, so as to prolong the intervals of truce, so as to walk the way of peace together. The transformation of relationship between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, between two jurisdictions and peoples in both parts of Northern Ireland, and of the bilateral relationship between the British and Irish governmental co-signatories, formed three interdependent axes of identity and self-other identification. This is crucial. Crucial too that they would act in concert as the macro framework that depend upon the vital personal and interpersonal transformation of mentalities, attitudes, and interaction between competing identities in new ways of understanding, belonging, and willingness to identify differently with others and to see through their eyes. Learning to reread history against the grain of one's tradition, people have been able to draw from the past what the future can use, as for example in terms of internecine native settler battles on Irish soil, as the outworking of far distant wars of religion in Europe. In Wright's geopolitical perspective, borders and frontiers are shown to be outposts of empire expansion, co-implicated in further borders and political alliances in frontiers beyond. Just looking for the arrow for this. Yeah, I've got it. Yeah. Just in summing up that part, you can see on the slide Britain and Ireland. I remember the first time I worked on this, I just put Ireland, and I then said, no, this can't be understood except in relationship between Britain and Ireland. And then, as I delved into it further and listened to others who are more knowledgeable in the politics of Europe from the 17th century on, I see that, and it will come up in some examples later, you can see that it can't be understood outside of those broader now geopolitical contexts. So, a little bit of history. I could have started with the Vikings, and if you're not into history, have a little snooze through this, and then you can just glance at the PowerPoint later. The British ploy, and it's not going to be a victim rant because everybody suffered in this. Everybody suffered, and everybody did dreadful things. But there are systems at work that need to be taken into account. So history and hermeneutics through Wright's theoretical framework. The British ploy of dispossessing the Irish of land and livelihood and settling the Scots Presbyterians on their confiscated land created in the 17th century. I took pity on you. I left out the intervening invasions and settlements, and there were several. So the settling of loyal Scots Presbyterians on confiscated land created an arena of frequent ethno-political uprisings and tit-for-tat killings against the outlawed Catholic Irish. The political religious strife, already troubling parts of Britain in the 1640s, for example, is significant here. The political religious strife, already troubling Britain, was offloaded in ways into Ireland, introducing a new sectarian dynamic into a country that had been more homogeneous in its religious tradition and social expressions. The Irish frontier would become an arena for wider European and religious proxy wars and a reliable lightning rod of encroaching invasion. A number of examples in the form of vignettes, one per century mainly, may suffice. One thinks, for example, of one of the rebellions of native Irish against King Charles I's imposition. First or second, I won't delay, imposition of the Protestant faith and withdrawal of political and civil entitlements to Catholics and Irish. Irish rebels, in response to that, in 1641, and there had been a series of them, these tit-for-tat uprisings and suppressions. But there was this very severe one in 1641 where Irish rebels drowned more than 100 Protestant settlers in the River Bann near Portadown, or shot them trying to escape, and that included women and children. This massacre became a defining religio-cultural memory for Protestants of heretical Catholic treachery, and a cycle of mimetic violence was unleashed. Meanwhile, a few years later, and the uprisings and tit-for-tat reactions continued. Meanwhile, in turn, this provoked General Oliver Cromwell's revenge conquest of Ireland, for example, in Wexford and Drogheda, in his role of God's executioner, the name of a recent biography by a Trinity College colleague, Micheál Ó Siochrú. In his role of God's executioner, slaughtering combatants and civilians alike, he routed Drogheda, defended by a mixed garrison of Irish Catholics and Royalists. The scale of slaughter is memorialised still in the town's geography. Thus, Scarlet Street historicises how its stones ran scarlet with the blood of armed rebels and innocent civilians. It's evident how such proxy wars operate in tandem with the metropolitan aims of England's coeval civil war, with Cromwell's commanding repertoire of violent purges and by parliamentary decree and penal frameworks which legally excluded through laws and other institutional and penal means Catholics, and in some respect other dissenters from all areas of political, civil and religious access and freedom. Politicized religion and sacralized politics were evident in symbolic reenactments of rebellion and subjugation. At one time, Unionist Protestant settlers, fiercely defending their faith understanding and identification as a divinely chosen people, covenanted to a faithful God, divinely appointed in loyalty to their Protestant faith to settle this promised land from which the native Irish were righteously expelled in punishment for their political treachery, religious apostasy, and popish idolatry. In turn, native resentment smouldered and fostered identities of tribal belonging, resistance against dispossession, expressed in collective oath promises, this is on the nationalist side, oath promises to reclaim lost land, liberty and freedom of religion. Irish Catholics cultivated images of victimhood, victory and defeat, blood sacrifice, and that would be very significant in the coming 2 centuries. Blood sacrifice as cleansing, condemned patriots and followers seeing such death in terms of martyrdom, so their memory could inspire their nation to remain true to religious and political freedom, the faith of their fathers, so their people might ultimately rise in victory to overthrow the infidel invaders through purity of faith and through being renewed in their superior religious culture and freedom. Patently, each community vaunted imagined representations of its victories and defeats as what Vamik Vulcan terms chosen glories and chosen traumas, each asserting its birthright of a holy nation and God-given legitimacy, while denouncing the other as traitor and heretic for their perversion of the true faith. This toxic brand of sacralized politics and politicized religion thus essentialized and reinforced identities in opposition, and in the double bind of insecure attachment to more of the same, insecure and precarious. But parties in its hard grip, the parties remained in its, would hold the destinies of all parties in its hard grip until relationships of respect and trust, dialogue and mutual interaction be given space and encouragement for growth and for the reconciling of memories and histories and of hope within history. So that's just another map emphasizing the political context. So I have another vignette that's really belongs to the turn of the 17th into the 18th century, and that's the rebellion of the United Irishmen. That's the one I'm coming to later. The earlier one at the end of the 17th century it was the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and the rise of the pan-Protestant Orange Order. Thus, the destinies of two ethno-religious groups were irrevocably interlocked with no liberating end in view. The now loyalist pro-British settlers, privileged by the Metropolitan Parliament in Westminster, also proved useful for macro-British political interests and for economic productivity. The Battle of the Boyne in 1690 was a decisive Protestant military victory when Prince William of Orange, who was married to Queen Mary, defeated Catholic King James of England on the banks of the Boyne, north of Dublin. Prince William of Orange, with his unquestionable Protestant lineage as Prince of Orange, had now secured the Protestant future of the British monarchy. The conclusive victory is still a high watermark of loyalist Protestant identity, reenacting hostile scenes of sectarian segregation each year on the 12th of July, in which the ancient cycle of violence is mobilized and reproduced in this anniversary, mainly in Northern Ireland, but also in England, Scotland, and parts of Africa and Canada and elsewhere. And Sorry. I think I'm missing a page. Anyway, that's an excuse to skip over a bit of history. No, unfortunately, I found it, but I will sharpen it here. The point I really want to reinforce there about the Battle of the Boyne is that the British, the Orange Order had been established a few years before in the early 16, around that. No, sorry, I'm going to skip forward. And will you give me a warning when I'm 15 minutes?
All the time you need.
Yeah. Yeah. The point I really want to make about the Battle of the Boyne is that it has become, and I apologise for using this word in the wrong way, it has become an iconic memory within the Protestant political mentality. But it cemented what would become an epoch-making an epoch-making event forging a Protestant royalist identity. The uprising of the United Irishmen in 1798 was influenced in part by the American War of Independence and by the French Revolution. So it was understandable that the British government was not impressed. So, but it did bring together Presbyterian, particularly thinking Presbyterians and some Anglicans and other dissenters with Roman Catholics in claiming an equal, a republic of equal citizens, and in terms of religion and democratic access and economic fairness. The significant thing about, there are two significant things I would stress. One was the ferocity with which the rebels were put down. Theobald Wolfe-Tone and Robert Emmet being the foremost of them. And you didn't need to be a Catholic to be executed in such fashion. And from that, they were cultivated, right through the 19th century, they were cultivated as martyrs and inspirers of a God-given heavenly kind of cause. Additionally, the formation of the Orange Order was seen by Britain as a potentially useful strategic tool for creating a pan-Protestant front so that Protestant and Catholics would not make common cause again. So again, the significance of the Parliament in Britain and the British interests, the interests of empire, because the beginnings of industrialization and linen making and so on played a part here. But it cemented this divide of clashing orange and green identities operating at a deeply structured level and holding this mimetic violence in the armory of both. There was one little thing I wanted to mention about the Battle of the Boyne, just jumping forward to the 20th century. And Ian Paisley, the Reverend Ian Paisley, whom some of you may have heard, he was against the against the Good Friday Agreement. He was even more against the Anglo-Irish Agreement because it actually toppled the framework of law that had operated since 1801. Because the second thing that happened at the 1798 rebellion was that the Irish Parliament was collapsed, and it didn't get up again until after the 1916 rebellion, and then without Britain's say-so. So you're the glorification of the leaders, and additionally the determination of Britain not to continue supporting the Orange Order and the pan-Protestant front. Through the 19th century, just galloping, see, 1801, the Act of Union created the UK, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. There was no longer a Dublin Parliament. There was some Catholic emancipation in 1829 with limited democratic reform. 1845 to 49, the Great Famine, where millions died and there was massive emigration. Britain and British landowners were blamed, in many cases not justifiably. But it fueled anti-British feeling. Burn nothing but coal when you're thinking about Britain. Burn everything but their coal when you're thinking of Britain. So the Irish struggles for land and religious equality continued through, and this is significant going forward into the 20th century, through two streams. One, constitutional nationalism. It was through the efforts of people like Daniel O'Connell, who we had a big commemoration of his birth or death recently. The constitutional route, and he had a part to play in securing Catholic emancipation. But you had this stream of constitutional national by peaceful means and the growing strength of physical force republicanism with recurring uprisings, martyr heroes, and in the 1860s there were further Fenian rebellions, equally as before suppressed. And then you had three successive Home Rule bills where two of them were not successful in the 1880s and early 2000s. But the third one was passed just before the Great War, but it was shelved because of the outbreak of the war. And it was defeated in Westminster, but eventually got through. The first two, but I'm massively jumping ahead here now, but I just want to give some sense of the Covenant politics playing out. This is now 2 centuries, well, a century, 17th century, 18th century, and now into the 20th century. Resistance to Home Rule by any means necessary. There was a Solemn League and Covenant in 1912, 2 years before that Home Rule bill was actually passed. And it was coined deliberately in terms of the same covenantal tradition of the Scottish Covenanters in the 17th century. And they were sending strong messages. Of the first 7 people that signed it, and it was, I think, 250,000 people signed it, 5 of the first 7 were church ministers. Women weren't allowed to sign it, but they had a separate declaration of their own. So they imported arms, and then Roger Casement, on behalf of the nationalist cause, imported arms through Kerry, but he was intercepted and executed. So the resistance to Home Rule was very strong. Then the Great War, where 250,000 Irish fight in the British Army. 30,000 to 50,000 perish. You had the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Protestant Military Battalion and the Royal Connaught Rangers. So you'd Catholic Irish nationalists also fighting in the Great War. But the Battle of the Somme, which was a major slaughter for the Irish, it sacralised Protestant Unionist identity. Somehow it didn't have that effect on the Catholic Irish. And this is some of the commemorative iconography or mural painting on the Shankill Road in Belfast in more recent times. A couple of years later, you have the Declaration of Independence, the uprising in the post office in Dublin. And like the Covenant statement, which had mirrored, again, the mimesis, there was an acceptance, an implicit acceptance that violence was necessary in the name of God and of the dead generations from which Ireland receives her old tradition of nationhood. So it mirrors the language of Covenant in ways. And so she summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. We hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign independent state. Pledge ourselves to the lives of our comrades in the cause of freedom. There followed an Anglo-Irish war, or a war of independence from Britain. It was savagely suppressed as well. And very soon a treaty was forced, and the Irish members of the new dependent parliament were willing to accept the treaty on an interim basis, with Ireland being divided into a 32-county republic, that's the green bit, and 6 counties in the north. And the border of the north was completely gerrymandered. If they'd done it as the province of Ulster, there would have been 9 counties, not 6, but it would have changed the balance to a more open and equal possibility of changing regimes in different elections. But it secured the Unionist majority until the Good Friday Agreement, effectively. Okay. I'll jump ahead to one of the themes in peace building has been to learn to confront the past, and there have been many groups working at that, and usually it was people working with other groups, church people working, and in some cases churches working and collaborating with other institutions. But on the whole, the institutional churches, I don't like using that phrase, but churches as institutions were slow to become too involved because it was still on the fringes of violence. So the obstacles to I'll skip that too. Because the twofold ballot in the one hand, Armalite in the other, strategy of both sides, and particularly of the IRA, the distrust deepened through all those 30 years of the Troubles, where nearly 4,000 people were killed and more than 40,000 severely injured. But the emergence from the conflict has been hesitant because the reality of trauma lingers in the shadows of the peace agreement. Is this where we begin? In a process of remembering that includes and shares the grief of the other, what Marguerite terms ethical remembering, arising from the bonds of relationship to one's own community and to stances of moral remembering towards all other communities. I would posit an affirmative response and propose that remembering as a shared process of mourning can play a liberating role towards forgiveness and reconciliation. Freud's mourning and melancholia needs no rehearsing here in terms of its threefold structure, so I'll skip over that. But mourning in Ireland has been deeply complicated. Douglas Davies, an Anglican priest and anthropologist, notes that offending deaths can stoke fires of violence, although at times they can also facilitate moves towards peace building and reconciliation. And many of the deaths were complicated in that there was no acknowledgement, there was cover-up, there were bodies concealed, some of them not found yet. Some of them had state involvement or collusion. There have been test cases on that. But I think at the same time, there was dramatic witness by ordinary people in calling to end the violence for good. Pierre Nora talks about the importance of moving from sites of memory or lieux de mémoire to milieu de mémoire. And I think churches can resonate with that because milieu is beyond flags and emblems and monumentalizing of the past. He's noted that lieux de mémoire were increasingly established in the modern context, but the milieu de mémoire are what are needed nowadays. They do reflect dispositions of power of state and church, but milieu permeate whole ways of life rooted in shared common humanity, faith, and inclusive forms of interrelational socializing and ecumenical engagement. I think I need to stop there. Yeah, all right. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. Just to give you this to finish with. can leave. It'll be written up properly. That's the peace line in Belfast. It goes on for miles. That's 1798. I didn't get these put into proper order. That's still up in Belfast on a Protestant estate. It blew down in a storm about 5 months ago, but it was built up again. We thought, oh, the storm has taken it. That was a bombing on the Shankill Road, a Protestant area in Belfast in 1988. I was at the memorial service. These are, you can see it go, the memory runs deep, and the internationalising and identifying with places, other places, and the need for healing through remembering. These are some sites of funerals that would have always been in places of separation, where people came together. That was when a young policeman was killed, who was both a member of the Gaelic Athletic Association and a policeman. And you have there the Unionist Prime Minister, the Republican Deputy First Minister, the Prime Minister of Ireland, and Gerry Adams, head of the IRA. That's the President of Ireland and the Queen of England praying at the war memorial for the Irish dead in war. And the Queen bowed her head. So.
Thank you for that very powerful presentation. You remind us how this Christian identity was wounded, but you're so kind, in a very kind way. Your pace and your way you're telling all those stories really touched us. So thank you. We're gonna move directly to Dr. Eleni Kaserlouri.
I think it's a very beautiful picture to finish our day, to end our day today, which was a hard day, a full day of discussions, of debates, but you are still having a very hard task for the next 10 minutes to tolerate my awful English pronunciation. It's a great joy and honor to be one of the responders at this conference, so I would like to warmly thank the organizers for the invitation. It is for the second time that I have the honor of participating in a meeting of the Ecclesiological Network. My first encounter with this group took place in Assisi, 2012, where I had the privilege of meeting, among others, Professor Gerald Magnon, with whom an excellent collaboration and friendship flourished. Professor Magnon, you know better than me, was a scholar wholly devoted to the theological enterprise, a man of vision and ecumenical spirit who inspired me through his integrity and intellect. Allow me, therefore, to dedicate my short contribution today to his memory. I also owe heartfelt thanks to Professor Smith for her inspiring paper. Through her analysis, I became familiar with a historical journey that I previously knew only in broad outlines and not in its full extent and dimensions. As is always the case, engagement with ideas, experiences, and perspectives of others cannot be entirely without presuppositions. I therefore speak as an Orthodox theologian, shaped by long experience in the ecumenical movement and by my Greek heritage. These attributes cannot be overlooked. They inevitably render my reading subjective and situated within a particular context. This year marks the 700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, an occasion that inspires so many conferences worldwide and gives us, Christians, the opportunity to discuss demanding and difficult issues which are historically and continually linked to the very identity and self-understanding of the Christian Church. A church that continues its journey and amid division, wounds and scars, traumas, even though the fundamental vision of its existence is that they may all be one. As the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew so characteristically states, the 1700th anniversary of the first ecumenical, and I quote, Ecumenical Council of Nicaea is a momentous occasion for the global Christian community, commemorating a pivotal event that defined the foundations of Christian doctrine. This historic council affirmed the divinity of Christ and established the Nicene Creed, a symbol of unity for all Christians. Let me pass. The legacy of the First Council of Nicaea remains of great significance in contemporary church life, both in its influence on fundamental Christology and ecclesiastical affairs, as well as its establishment of the importance of dialogue in addressing theological and pastoral issues. And I close the quote. Professor Smith's paper offers an excellent opportunity for discussing the concepts of peace, war, the Church's embrace of political power, and the open wounds and deep traumas left behind by any conflict, especially when such conflict is clothed in religious identity. As she characteristically stated, when religion becomes a vehicle of hatred, sectarianism, and resentment, then the very heart of the gospel is distorted. The Irish story, from the Easter Rising of 1916 to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, is more than a political history. It's a meditation on how identity, nationalism, and religious intertwine to create both division and possibilities for peace. Ireland's experience illustrates how narratives of martyrdom, victimhood, and sacrifice can inspire resistance, but also perpetuate cycles of violence. It also shows how reconciliation requires structures of dialogue, mutual respect, and recognition of differences. Even more, it brings us face to face with significant questions. In our own time, when the shadow of war once again looms over Europe, when the commandment to love one's brother, and even more so one's enemy, appears difficult, if not impossible, and when people are compelled to leave their homelands, sacrificing national or other identities in search of refuge, how can the Christian churches credibly speak of reconciliation and restoration? For the Orthodox tradition, which has lived through centuries of imperial politics, national awakenings, and interconfessional conflicts, there is a rich heritage of patristic teaching on peace, conciliarity, and reconciliation, where we may seek answers, or even better, gather the resources with which to shape our own responses within our particular context. Tradition can always serve as a resource of inspiration, but also as a reminder of errors and human sinfulness. An Orthodox reading recalls St. Chrysostom's insistence that nothing is equal to peace. For Chrysostom, peace is not merely the absence of war, but the condition in which human beings can pursue holiness and communion with God. The Troubles represented a tragic failure to embody this vision. As Father John McGuckin notes, and I quote, war remains what it has been always, one of the curses of the human race, tragic after its death, orphans, widows, disease, destruction of the environment, the cities, rape, forced prostitution, and all manner of human weakness and misery. Even wars fought in the name of justice have led to many instances of the just finally acting as badly as the weak and losing sight of their goal. The Orthodox theology also critiques the collapse of religious identity into political tribalism. This reflects what Father Alexander Zmemal called the secularization of Christianity, where religious symbols are emptied of their eschatological meaning and reduced to cultural markers. The concept of war is often associated exclusively with large-scale conflicts between nations or religious groups. Yet, if we look more closely, war is not limited to this dramatic confrontation. It also manifests itself in subtle but equally destructive ways. domestic violence, bullying in schools, the exploitation of human beings by one another, and countless other forms of conflict. All of these situations reveal that humanity has learned to wage war against its own brother and sister in different contexts and for different reasons. This broader understanding of war raises an important question. To what extent does religious faith and identity act as an obstacle or conversely as a force that counters and prevents such destructive behaviors? Religious identity can, in certain cases, serve as a hindrance to peace. When faith is interpreted narrowly, fanatically, or superficially, okay, it is my turn now. Okay, is there a page? Is there? No? Okay, there is a problem. Yeah. Yeah. The church task is not neutrality, but prophetic witness. As Chrysostom III and against imperial injustice, so churches today must resist becoming chaplains of nationalist projects. The church, when faithful to her diaconia and nature, stands not with tribe, but with truth, calling all to repentance and reconciliation. She critiques the idolatry of nationalism that baptizes political violence as martyrdom. It offers the Trinity as a model of unity in diversity, the cross as the victory of love over violence, and theosis as the ultimate horizon of human reconciliation, prophetic witness, conciliar structures, and patient bridge building. The Council of Nicaea and the Good Friday Agreement stand as two very different milestones, one theological, one political, yet both remind us that unity is not automatic. It requires dialogue, sacrifice, and structures that honor difference while affirming communion. From my Orthodox point of view, Island Sorry is a parable. Peace is never cheap, but it is possible when communities allow grace to transfigure opposition into reconciliation. From Scripture to the Fathers, from Byzantium to the modern era, the Church insists the kingdom of God is not of this world, yet it transforms the world by truth and love. As the 1994 Sabbathist Statement on Orthodoxy and the Challenges of the Modern World affirms, and I quote, the Church does not identify itself with any political system, but calls all to repentance, justice, and peace in the light of the kingdom that is to come. In our age of nationalism, authoritarianism, and conflict, Christian churches are called not to sacralize power, but to critique it, offering the world a vision of cruciform authority rooted in communion, justice, and love. Most of the Orthodox churches have always lived in tension with political power, emerging within the Roman Empire, expanding under Byzantium, surviving under the Ottomans, and adapting to modern nation states. Orthodoxy has had to define its relationship with the rulers and regimes in constantly shifting context. Unlike the Latin West, which developed the doctrine of the two swords, spiritual and temporal, the East preferred the language of symphonia, a harmony between Emperor and Patriarch. Yet this harmony was fragile and at times collapsed into Caesaropapism or ecclesiastical manipulation of rulers. So the Church cannot escape political realities. It must find ways to engage rulers, defend justice, and serve society without compromising its spiritual mission. I will close my paper with Professor Philip Lemaster's words, and I quote, Orthodoxy's distinctive stance on peace, war, and violence does not view war as decidedly good or holy. Orthodoxy has neither a crusade ethic nor an explicit just war theory. I know you have some questions here. We will discuss it later. Instead, the Church tolerates war as an inevitable tragic necessity for the protection of the innocent and the vindication of justice. The canons of the Church suggest a period of repentance for those who have killed in war, which indicates both that taking life is spiritually damaging and that a blood falls short of Christ's normative way of non-resistant, non-violent love. Peacemaking is the common vocation of all Christians, But the pursuit of peace in a corrupt world at times inevitably requires the use of force. In such circumstances, the Church provides spiritual therapy for healing from the damaging effects of taking life. In every divine liturgy, the Church prays for the peace of the world and all its inhabitants, and participates in the heavenly banquet of the kingdom to which all, soldier and pacifists alike, are invited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleni, for the response. I would like to thank both, actually, speakers, how they highlight how religious identity can either fuel conflict or serve as a spring of reconciliation. Directly, the floor is yours. We don't have much time, but we can accept half a question. Okay, 2-3 questions, okay? Yes.
Thank you, Stephen Brown. Thank you for both presentations. I was very moved by the pictures that I saw, the images that you showed, Geraldine, of what has happened in part of my country, I guess, as well. But I was also moved by your final image of this sculpture. I've seen also casts of this sculpture in Coventry Cathedral, destroyed by German bombing. In Berlin, on what was once the death strip between East and West Berlin. I believe there were also copies in Hiroshima as well. My question is, how can we find symbols of reconciliation like this to take us forward? Because reconciliation is not just an intellectual exercise, but it's an exercise of all of the senses.
Should we collect or... Okay, we can respond to this one. Yeah. Okay, yeah, Jason. Yeah. Let's collect the question then we can sum up.
Jason Welly from Boston College. Thank you very much for the paper. Perhaps this relates to the previous question. I was interested in the way you drew on Pierre Nora and Lieu de Mémoire, but the idea of a distinction between that and a milieu de mémoire was something I hadn't known. As I understood him on Lieu de Mémoire, is that these places of meaning are by their nature ambiguous. And we structure meaning into them, but they don't really mean anything in and of themselves. We are meaning-making machines. If I heard you right in speaking about the milieu, somehow the lesson or the meaning found in these loci is somehow more stable and healthy and positive, if I heard you correctly. So there's a different way of asking the question, how do we find symbols for peace building and reconciliation? If you could add a word about Nora, please.
Do we have a third one, or should we proceed? Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it over here first.
Yeah.
Ronnie Eggleston, Union of Charismatic Orthodox Churches. With the subject matter, you speak from strictly a European perspective versus the issues of colonialism against people of color. How do you bring together the whole issue of what is considered, I'll talk about in the United States, as black on black crime, when we talk about what happened between England and Ireland as white on white crime, versus the issues of there's no real attempt for reclamation, restoration of lands of people of color, and things like that when we look at how Christianity was utilized to perpetuate violence against people of color.
I think we can start.
In relation to, I'll start with the first one. In relation to the symbols and meaning making, I'll start with Ricoeur's axiom: the symbol gives rise to thought. I like the idea of the thinking being and the symbolic imagination that we're gifted with as being two sides of a coin. I think sourcing symbols, in my experience, it's been, apart from the deep symbols of our Christian tradition, and I think we always come back to those anyway, but we don't necessarily begin with them. But in my experience, good symbols that bond and unite and leave some open questions can be sourced in the past or the present, but I think they've emerged in encounters, in my context, from people who are wrestling together, people who are listening to one another, people who are struggling with suffering, people who are confused by the past and find forgiveness difficult. One of my mentors, Gabriel Daly, an Augustinian theologian, used to say, sometimes we suffer from an unbaptized imagination. I like the phrase, and I like the way it brings together the baptismal imagery of water and of depth and of being drawn into communion and membership. Baptism as what is a common bond between Christians. And thanks to the whole BEM process, we've kind of absorbed that and begun to integrate it in many ways. One of the little pictures that I zoomed through there at the end was of a drawing by young people from different parts of the world who came to a Presbyterian peace building centre in Belfast, where they drew the history with the river going through it. So symbols like water, like fire, like deep cavernous places for prayer, like in the Cree in Corrymeela, where people go almost into the earth and allow the feelings to emerge and allow the thinking that has been shared to be in some way wrestled with or integrated. But I think we do need new symbols, but I think the best of the new symbols are very often rooted in the ancient symbols of our tradition of light and dark and earth and light and the Paschal mystery. I think the Paschal mystery is the deep symbol that I constantly live within as best I can in terms of trying to make sense of the experiences around me.
Thank you for your questions, which are challenging according to my evaluation. First of all, I think that I agree with Professor that we might use some symbols that they are existing in our traditions. For example, even the cross could be a symbol of reconciliation if the two groups that they are in conflict decide that this is a symbol that express their experience of conflict. But there are also symbols coming from the roots and not, I would say, religious symbols. For example, we attended a lecture of His Eminence Bishop of Nigeria, Alexandros, where he brought a scalp from Africa, from Nigeria, where three people, they have a common stomach. And he said that when he wanted to explain to the people there what is the Holy Trinity all about, he used this figure. I think if we find symbols within the traditions, I mean not the religious tradition, but the local tradition, we may also give them a new meaning and reading them with a new perspective.
The other two questions, maybe, yeah.
From Africa, thank you for your question. I was, I suppose, concentrating on Northern Ireland in a way as a case study, but I have references in the paper to Africa in a different way. And it was the role of Nelson Mandela and the role of Alex Boraine. Alex Boraine, white South Africa, Nelson Mandela from the Xhosa tribe up in the Transkei, where I have visited. When the parties were trying to build relationships, but were doing it very reluctantly, they were brought out to places like South Africa, where there had been deep trauma, deep suffering from apartheid, with its roots in colonial histories and of oppression from at least 3 countries, including Britain. And they insisted in staying in separate hotels. The Sinn Féin and the Loyalist former combatants, they insisted, not former, they were still in combat, but they were secret talks to try and build rapport in a safe space beyond. And I was listening to Pádraig O'Malley at a lecture on boundaries and bonds in Belfast on the theme of sectarianism at the School of Ecumenics ran. He'd had a few drinks too many before he came into the auditorium, and he kept us waiting for nearly an hour. It wasn't quite that bad. Oiled by the whiskey, he allowed himself to get angry, and it was a righteous anger. And he said, we were being too self-indulgent in terms of making the moves towards one another, and when people were crying out for peace. And people had come from Africa to help us. People had come to give us advice from their experience. And he said, President Mandela, he said, a giant in peace building, a giant of a man a giant of forgiveness. What did they do to him? President of the Rainbow Nation, they forced him to reinvent apartheid in his own country. It still blows my mind. So it's not answering the question the way you posed it, and I apologize for that. It just wasn't within my remit. But I'm deeply grateful for the contribution of Africans in helping us to build towards the healing of relationships, and the need for justice, and the need for non-selective remembering, and the need for being able to transcend our divided histories. Do you want to do the other?
Just a short comment. I think war violence and its implication, it's the same all over the world, despite the culture, the color, or whatever. So we should discuss these issues open, with honesty, and I think this will help. That's why I think ecumenical meetings and gatherings help us to see the perspectives of others, and to understand that we share common experience on many levels, and in order to overcome all these dramas, we have to work together. So we were not inclusive, unfortunately, at our presentations, but from the very beginning, I think we explained to you that this is a contextual experience. A contextual experience doesn't mean that is not also an experience with common characteristics with other people around the world.
Okay, I'm in a very difficult position right now because I have to close, unfortunately, this plenary. I know that many issues were brought up, many thoughts, many questions. It's not something that can be, of course, answered there, but we have also tomorrow. So we'll have the chance to continue those discussions also during coffee breaks, during lunches. I believe that these contributions both, and thank you very much, Professor Smith and Dr. Kaseluri, they challenge us to see the peace as not as a passive absence of war, but as an active and a spiritual vocation.